Caleb Whitmore was just 17 when he walked into a police station with a journal, a flash drive, and a secret that would shatter his entire world. His mother, Melissa Whitmore, a beloved family therapist, had murdered his father and buried him in their backyard. This wasn't just another crime. It was a betrayal so profound it forced a son to choose truth over blood and testify against the woman who raised him. What led to this unimaginable decision? And how did the perfect family image hide such a chilling reality? The Whitmore family lived in Cedar Hollow, a peaceful, tree-lined town known for its quiet streets, close-knit community, and its firm belief in traditional family values. It was the kind of place where neighbors still brought each other casseroles, kids rode their bikes until sunset, and everyone knew your name. Among the many families who lived there, none were more admired or envied than the Whitmores. Melissa Whitmore was more than just a resident. She was a symbol of success. A licensed family therapist with multiple degrees, she had built a thriving private practice that catered to couples and families throughout the county. Her soothing voice and sharp mind made her a favorite among clients, and her polished image, neatly tailored clothes, perfect posture, a warm but firm tone, earned her frequent appearances on local television. She spoke at town meetings and was often invited to schools to give talks on communication, parenting, and emotional health. She even published a modestly successful self-help book, The Honest Home, which emphasized radical transparency in family life. Ironically, that title would one day ring with bitter irony. Her son Caleb was equally impressive in the public eye. A shy but brilliant teenager with a deep interest in psychology and literature, Caleb rarely got into trouble and was often found reading during recess while other kids played basketball. Teachers described him as polite, introspective, and wise beyond his years. He had won multiple essay contests, consistently made the honor roll, and was already earning college credits through a local dual enrollment program. Though not particularly social, he was respected by his peers and adored by his instructors. Together, Melissa and Caleb seemed like a perfect team. They were often seen attending church on Sundays, sharing coffee at the town cafe, or walking their golden retriever through the neighborhood trails. To anyone observing from the outside, it looked like a dream scenario. A mother raising her son alone successfully and gracefully, after her husband had mysteriously left years before. People in town would often comment on Melissa's strength and resilience, praising her for how she carried on, built a business, and raised such a remarkable child. Few people ever questioned what had happened to Greg Whitmore. The official story was simple, if sad. 5 years earlier, Greg, a quiet man who worked as a civil engineer, had vanished overnight. Melissa told police he had left after a bitter argument, abandoning his family without explanation. She mentioned struggles with depression, late-night drinking, and feelings of professional failure. No note was left behind. No financial accounts were accessed after his disappearance. He simply vanished. The police searched, but there were no signs of foul play. Given Melissa's professional credibility and Greg's apparent mental health struggles, authorities eventually concluded that he had either run off to start a new life or taken his own. The case was filed as a missing person, and then slowly, quietly closed. Melissa adjusted the narrative publicly. She would talk about the pain of being abandoned and the strength it took to move on. She shared this experience in her therapy sessions and used it as part of her lectures, discussing the psychological impacts of parental abandonment on children. Caleb, for his part, rarely spoke about his father. When asked, he would say in a measured voice that his father left one night and never came back. It was an accepted truth in Cedar Hollow, but beneath the surface something didn't feel right. Over the years there were small, strange details that didn't quite fit. A neighbor once recalled hearing what sounded like a violent argument late one night at the Whitmore home. followed by a loud thud. Another remembered seeing Melissa out in the backyard in the middle of the night during a rainstorm, digging at the base of the garden with a large metal shovel. At the time, no one thought much of it. The Whitmores had always been a private family, and grief manifests in strange ways. But later these memories would resurface with chilling clarity. Even within the house there were shadows. Caleb, though a model student and obedient son, had changed subtly after his father's disappearance. He became quieter, more withdrawn. He rarely invited friends over and seemed to live in a state of constant observation. He would watch his mother carefully, how she moved through rooms, how she locked certain doors, how she avoided certain topics. He never confronted her, not directly. But from the moment Greg vanished, Caleb began to question everything. Still, life continued. Melissa's business grew. Caleb advanced through school. The years passed, and the mystery of Greg Whitmore faded into the background. Eventually, no one in Cedar Hollow brought it up anymore. The neighborhood moved on. The Whitmores were still seen as one of the town's finest families, an example of perseverance, of rebuilding, of success against the odds. Then came the summer that changed everything. Melissa had decided to invest in an outdoor renovation project. Her practice had been doing exceptionally well, and she wanted to transform the backyard into a retreat space, somewhere clients could participate in therapy sessions surrounded by nature. She hired a local landscaping company to remove the old patio, tear out some overgrown flower beds, and lay a new stone walkway that would lead to a meditation gazebo. The work began smoothly. The team arrived early each morning and tore through the aging backyard with ease. But on the fourth day, they hit something hard beneath one of the flower beds. It wasn't a rock, it wasn't a pipe. It was a large, rusted metal container, buried just beneath the surface. Curious, the workers forced it open. What they found inside would stop the entire project cold. Wrapped in a black tarp, bound with old rope, and surrounded by the decaying remnants of what looked like clothing, were human remains. The bones were aged, but unmistakably human. The workers called the police immediately. The property was sealed off within hours. Crime scene tape went up around the charming white picket fence. News vans arrived by nightfall. Melissa, caught off guard, offered no answers. In a statement to police, she said she had no idea how a body could have ended up buried in her garden. She speculated, half-heartedly, that it could have been someone from long before they owned the home. But detectives weren't convinced. Forensic teams moved quickly, and within a few days dental records confirmed what some in Cedar Hollow had already begun to suspect. The body was Greg Whitmore. The town was stunned. Melissa was publicly devastated, claiming she had no involvement and insisting she had believed Greg was still alive somewhere. She wept for the cameras and spoke about closure. But whispers started to spread. Who buries their husband in their backyard and doesn't know? Why had the backyard never been touched for all those years? Why had Caleb never spoken of his father in any personal terms? No one knew it yet, but the real shock was still to come. Because Melissa's quiet, observant son had secrets of his own, and he was about to break the silence that had protected his family for far too long. The day the remains were identified as Greg Whitmore's, Cedar Hollow transformed from a peaceful suburb into the center of a growing media storm. What had once been whispered suspicions quickly turned into open speculation. Police cars parked outside the Whitmore home became a permanent fixture. Reporters hovered near the end of the driveway, filming updates against a backdrop of yellow crime scene tape and flower beds turned to mud. Melissa Whitmore, who had once appeared on television offering advice about healthy family dynamics, was now at the center of a murder investigation. At first, Melissa appeared composed. She gave a brief statement outside her home, dressed in a conservative navy blouse and slacks, her hair pulled back in a tidy bun. Her voice trembled as she spoke of her shock, saying she was horrified to learn her husband's body had been found in such a tragic and unimaginable way. She told reporters she believed Greg had left voluntarily years ago, and that she had never stopped hoping he would return. She claimed to have no idea how he ended up buried in their backyard. The community didn't know what to believe. For years they had trusted her. Many had sought her help in moments of personal crisis. But now, cracks were forming in the polished image she had so carefully constructed. Rumors spread quickly. About the night Greg vanished, about the locked basement door, and about the night someone heard shouting from the house followed by eerie silence. Neighbors began to recall moments that had once seemed insignificant. Someone remembered seeing Melissa carrying garbage bags to the car in the middle of the night. Another recalled seeing her dig in the backyard during a storm. What had once seemed like odd behavior now took on a sinister new meaning. Police secured a warrant to search the entire Whitmore property. They combed through the house, the garage, the attic, and the basement. Items were bagged and tagged, from old tools to computers to handwritten notes. They removed several boxes of files from Melissa A.'s home office and searched her therapy practice as well. Forensic teams tested soil samples, examined the storage shed, and scanned the entire yard with ground-penetrating radar. They were looking for anything that could explain how Greg's body had ended up buried in his own backyard. As the investigation deepened, so did the public's curiosity about Caleb. Now 17, he had remained out of sight since the body was found. He was seen once, briefly, being escorted by a detective into a black SUV. Questions swirled around him. What had he known? Had he witnessed anything? Did he suspect his mother? No one knew. Melissa had claimed her son was distraught and needed privacy. She told reporters that he was in therapy, trying to process the trauma. But behind closed doors, Caleb was making a decision that would change everything. One afternoon, just days after his father's remains were officially identified, Caleb quietly walked into the Cedar Hollow Police Department. He wasn't accompanied by his mother or a lawyer. He asked to speak to a detective, stating calmly that he had something important to share. The officers were surprised. Up until that moment, Caleb had said little and appeared withdrawn. But now, he was ready to talk. He was brought into a small interview room, and what followed would shift the entire course of the investigation. Caleb began by handing over a thick leather-bound journal. It was well worn, filled with pages of neat handwriting. The earliest entries dated back 5 years, just before his father's disappearance. He explained that he had started journaling on the advice of a teacher who noticed his withdrawn behavior and encouraged him to write down his thoughts. At first, the entries were innocent. Notes about school, books he was reading, thoughts about friends. But over time they became darker. He began documenting things he saw around the house, changes in his mother's behavior, strange sounds at night, and comments she made that didn't sit right with him. He described how his mother would lock herself in the basement for hours at a time, sometimes late at night, sometimes in the early morning. He wrote about a particular night when he heard loud voices and a crash, followed by a long silence. The next morning, his father was gone. According to Caleb's journal, Melissa told him that Greg had left the family in a moment of weakness and that he shouldn't ask questions. She discouraged him from talking about his father with others and eventually stopped mentioning him at all. Caleb, young and frightened, obeyed, but he kept writing. Over the years, he grew more suspicious. He began to notice other things. Tools in the garage moved from their usual places, a persistent smell coming from the basement, and a tarp in the shed that disappeared one day and never returned. He began to feel that something had gone terribly wrong. But the journal wasn't all Caleb brought. He also handed over a small USB flash drive. On it were dozens of audio files. When asked what they were, he explained that he had secretly begun recording conversations in the house, quietly, cautiously, using an old phone that he hid behind a stack of books in the living room. He had no real plan at the time, just a growing need to understand the truth. He admitted that some of the recordings were mundane, but others were different. One file, dated 2 years after Greg's disappearance, included a conversation in which Melissa, apparently unaware she was being recorded, said something chilling. "It's better this way. He would have ruined everything." That one line sent a chill through the detectives. It wasn't a confession, but it was close. Combined with the journal, it suggested that Melissa had not only known about her husband's fate, but had played a role in it. As Caleb continued to speak, his voice remained calm, even clinical. He explained that he had wanted to believe his mother. He tried to think the best of her, but over time her actions stopped making sense. Her explanations didn't hold up. And when the body was found, he knew it was time to speak. The detectives listened in stunned silence. They had considered Melissa a suspect since the body was discovered, but without a witness or direct evidence, it had been difficult to move forward. Now, they had both. Caleb's statement, his journal, and the audio recordings provided a clear new path. The investigators launched a deeper forensic analysis of the house, particularly the basement. Hidden behind a false wall panel, they found a tarp similar to the one Caleb had described, stained with what appeared to be old blood. A metal crowbar with traces of dried tissue was also found tucked behind a row of paint cans. Lab results would later confirm the blood and tissue belonged to Greg Whitmore. With mounting evidence, the police had enough to act. Melissa was arrested 1 week later at her office, where she had been in the middle of a session with a client. The charges were serious: first-degree murder, obstruction of justice, and tampering with evidence. The news of her arrest broke the town's fragile trust. People who had once sought her help now questioned everything. How could someone so composed, so respected, be capable of such a crime? And perhaps more disturbing, how had she kept the secret for so long? In the aftermath, all eyes turned once more to Caleb. The boy who had been raised by the town's most admired woman had shattered her entire world with a journal and a flash drive. But his role wasn't over yet. The case was heading to trial, and Caleb would soon be asked to do something no child should ever have to face. He would have to take the stand against his own mother. The trial hadn't even started yet, but the case had already captured national attention. News outlets from outside Cedar Hollow began arriving, their vans and satellite dishes turning the quiet town into a media hotspot. The headlines were impossible to ignore. Family therapist accused of husband's murder, buried secrets in the garden, son turns on his mother. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. How could a mother, praised for her guidance on love and parenting, be accused of something so horrific? And more importantly, how could her own child be the one to reveal her darkest secret? Caleb Whitmore's decision to go to the police had changed everything. Until then, the case had been troubling but circumstantial. The discovery of Greg Whitmore's remains was tragic, yes, but it didn't immediately prove Melissa's guilt. There were questions, suspicions, and inconsistencies in her story, but no definitive proof that she had committed murder. Caleb's journal and recordings shifted the entire investigation into something far more concrete. He had offered context. He had offered motive. He had brought clarity to a mystery that had lingered for 5 long years. Once Melissa was arrested, she was denied bail. Prosecutors argued that she posed a flight risk and that the evidence against her was overwhelming. In a preliminary hearing, the prosecution laid out what they had: a body buried in the backyard, audio suggesting foreknowledge of the crime, and a hidden blood-stained tarp in the basement. But their most compelling witness, without question, was Caleb. And that fact made the case even more sensational. The idea of a son testifying against his own mother was too dramatic to ignore. The media latched onto the angle with a fervor, and Caleb's name was soon known far beyond Cedar Hollow. Despite the attention, Caleb stayed out of sight. After giving his statement, he was placed in protective custody, far from the glare of the cameras. He finished high school remotely under the guidance of a tutor, and was kept away from reporters and family members. Prosecutors recognized how sensitive his role would be in court. Caleb was not just a witness, he was the key to the entire narrative. If he failed on the stand, if he changed his story, if he broke under pressure, it could jeopardize the entire case. The trial was scheduled to begin 9 months after Melissa's arrest. In that time, lawyers from both sides built their cases. The prosecution assembled timelines, expert witnesses, and forensic evidence. The defense, meanwhile, focused on undermining Caleb's credibility. They painted him as a troubled teen, someone who had grown resentful of his mother and was manipulating facts to get attention. They claimed his recordings were taken out of context and that the journal could be a mixture of real memories and distorted perceptions. In early spring, the courtroom filled to capacity as the trial began. Reporters were not allowed to film inside, but artists sketched the scene, and every moment was carefully documented by journalists. Melissa appeared each day dressed in dark suits, her face emotionless, her eyes often locked straight ahead. She denied the charges and refused all interview requests. Her defense team described her as a devoted mother, unfairly targeted due to circumstantial evidence and a confused, emotionally unstable son. But when Caleb took the stand, the courtroom changed. He entered quietly, dressed simply in a navy sweater and khakis, looking more like a college student than a key witness in a murder trial. He took his seat, swore his oath, and faced the rows of strangers ready to judge him, not only for what he said but for his very decision to speak. He began by explaining who he was, not just a name, but a person. He talked about his childhood, his love for books, his quiet nature. Then he moved into the night his father disappeared. He didn't dramatize it. He didn't raise his voice. He just stated the facts as he remembered them. The yelling, the crash, the silence. The way his mother told him not to worry, that Greg had left them, and that it was for the best. The prosecution led him through the journal entries. Caleb read some aloud, including one that described how weeks after his father vanished he found a shirt in the basement with what looked like blood on it. His mother told him it was paint and threw it away. He mentioned the audio recordings and the moment he first realized that something was deeply wrong, not just odd, not just confusing, but wrong. He described the chilling moment when he first played back a recording and heard his mother's voice speaking as if Greg was a problem she had solved. Every eye in the room was on him, even Melissa's. But Caleb didn't glance at her. He kept his gaze steady and forward, answering each question with clarity and calm. The only time his voice wavered was when he was asked why he waited so long to come forward. He took a deep breath and said simply, "Because I loved her, and I wanted to believe she was telling the truth." The cross-examination from the defense was brutal. They accused him of fabricating details, of being influenced by media and stress, of twisting his memories. They brought up a brief therapy stay he had after his father's disappearance, suggesting it proved mental instability. They tried to catch him in contradictions, pointing out small inconsistencies in dates and descriptions from his journal. Caleb answered each question slowly, sometimes pausing for long seconds before speaking. He didn't snap. He didn't argue. He just told the story again the same way he had told it to the police months earlier. By the time he stepped down from the witness stand, the courtroom was silent. In the days that followed, Other evidence was presented. Forensic experts testified that the tool found in the basement matched the type of injury observed on Greg S.'s skull. Soil samples from the garden matched particles found on Melissa's boots stored in the garage. A computer forensics analyst explained how Melissa had searched terms like decomposition timeline and how long does it take for a body to disappear in the weeks following Greg S.'s disappearance. But none of it hit as hard as Caleb's testimony, not because it was the most technical or even the most incriminating, but because it came from a place that should have been safe. The betrayal wasn't just of a husband by a wife. It was of a child by a parent, and it was the child who had delivered the truth. The defense made one last plea, arguing that there was no direct evidence linking Melissa to the act of murder. They insisted she was being tried not on facts but on feelings, on the powerful emotions stirred by a grieving boy. They begged the jury to separate sympathy from proof. But it was too late. Caleb had done more than testify. He had painted a picture of a home filled with silence, suspicion, and control. And that picture was far more powerful than any forensic report. The trial was nearly over, and a verdict was coming. But for everyone who had watched Caleb take the stand, it was already clear. The truth had finally come out, and it came from the one voice Melissa never expected to turn against her: her own son. The courtroom was quiet as the jury filed back in. 12 men and women, each one carrying the weight of weeks of testimony, evidence, and emotional turmoil. The gallery was full. Reporters scribbled in notepads, local residents sat in stunned silence, and security officers watched every move. At the center of it all sat Melissa Whitmore, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed forward, unreadable. Just a few feet away, her son Caleb remained still, his expression blank, as though he had already lived this moment many times in his head. The verdict was swift. Guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, obstruction of justice, and tampering with evidence. The jurors had taken only 4 hours to deliberate, and when the words were read aloud, no one gasped. No one cried out. The truth had been slowly building layer by layer, and now it sat heavy over the entire courtroom like a thundercloud that had finally released its rain. Melissa showed no reaction, not a twitch, not a tear. Some said later that she appeared relieved, as if the weight of the secret she had carried for 5 years had finally been taken from her. Others believed she was simply in shock, unwilling to believe that her perfect image, mother, therapist, pillar of the community, had crumbled beyond repair. The sentencing hearing came days later, and the judge made his decision clear. Life in prison, without the possibility of parole. He called the crime premeditated and cruel, committed not in a moment of passion, but in a calculated effort to preserve status and control. He spoke of deception, manipulation, and betrayal, not just of a husband, but of a child. And when the gavel came down for the final time, Melissa Whitmore was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs, her name now synonymous with one of the most disturbing crimes the town had ever seen. The reaction in Cedar Hollow was a mix of disbelief and shame. How could no one have seen it? How had she fooled them all for so long? Families who had once relied on her for counseling now looked back with horror, wondering what dark thoughts might have been behind the comforting words she had offered. Her books were pulled from shelves at the local library. Her practice was permanently closed, and clients who had once praised her as life-changing now struggled to reconcile the woman they trusted with the murderer revealed in court. But no one felt the aftershocks more deeply than Caleb. He had testified with a calm that impressed everyone, but once the trial was over, the real weight of what he had done began to settle in. The cameras moved on, the reporters left town, and the public's attention turned to the next story. But Caleb was left with the consequences of exposing his mother's crime. He hadn't just lost a parent. He had destroyed the person everyone thought she was. And in doing so, he had torn himself away from the only family he had left. There was no return to normal for him. He didn't go back to the same school. He didn't walk the same streets. He moved out of Cedar Hollow under the quiet protection of victim services, taking on a new identity to shield himself from the inevitable media attention that followed his name. A few journalists tried to track him down, offering money for interviews or exclusive rights to his story, but he declined every time. His voice had already been heard in the courtroom, and that was enough. He didn't want fame. He didn't want sympathy. He wanted to rebuild. He enrolled in an out-of-state university under a pseudonym, studying, perhaps ironically, criminal psychology. His professors would later describe him as brilliant, though deeply private. He rarely spoke in class unless called upon, and even then his words were precise, as if measured before release. He kept to himself, forming few close connections, but his work was exceptional. He wrote papers that probed the minds of killers, examining not just what they did, but why they did it. He once submitted a research project titled Pathological Duality, the Hidden Self, which his advisor later called one of the most hauntingly insightful papers they had ever read. Meanwhile, Melissa adjusted, or perhaps didn't, to life in prison. Reports from the correctional facility described her as quiet, aloof, and largely unresponsive to other inmates. She refused most visitors and spent hours in the prison library, often rereading her own published works. There were rumors that she began writing again, this time privately, though whether it was a memoir, a confession, or just journals, no one could say. She never made a public statement. No interviews, no appeals, no expressions of remorse. Some wondered if she was waiting for Caleb to reach out, waiting for some sort of letter or visit. But it never came. Back in Cedar Hollow, the Whitmore house sat empty for months before being sold quietly to an investor who planned to demolish it. The backyard was flattened, the flower beds removed. A concrete patio was poured where the remains had once been found. The town tried to move on, but there were scars. The case had shaken the community's sense of safety. It had made people look twice at what they thought they knew about their neighbors, about their friends. And perhaps most uncomfortably, it had made them question how easily a person could hide darkness behind a smile. Every so often someone would bring up Caleb, what had become of him, whether he was okay. Some said they had heard rumors of him working with law enforcement as a criminal profiler. Others believed he had vanished into anonymity, choosing a life far removed from everything he had been through. But no one really knew. He had walked into the police station as a teenage boy with a journal and a flash drive. He had taken the stand and broken a silence that had hidden the truth for 5 years. And when it was over, he had left everything behind. Not just his home, not just his mother, but the identity he had once lived in. In the end, justice was served. A murderer was convicted. A town was shaken awake. And a son, once trapped in a home filled with secrets, found the courage to speak when it mattered most. But the cost was something no court could measure. Because while the world saw Caleb as the boy who testified against his mother, he would always carry something more private. The memory of what it meant to grow up in a lie, and the strength it took to tear it all down. Years passed. The media storm faded, the headlines disappeared, and the world moved on from the case that once gripped the nation. But for those closest to the tragedy, the aftermath remained, lingering quietly beneath the surface of their lives. What had begun as a seemingly normal family's slow collapse had ended in a courtroom, with a boy testifying against his mother for the murder of his father. The verdict had brought closure to many. But for Caleb Whitmore, closure was far more complicated. After the trial, Caleb was placed into a witness protection program. The state, recognizing both the media interest and the emotional fallout, worked to relocate him and give him a new start. He changed his name, his location, even his appearance slightly, trading the clean-cut look of a high school senior for a more anonymous presence. He cut ties with his past completely. No social media, no contact with former friends, no public statements. While most young adults moved through life with an open trail of photographs, milestones, and memories, Caleb moved through his with quiet precision. He enrolled in college under a different name far from Cedar Hollow. He pursued a degree in criminal psychology, drawing from a life that had been shaped by manipulation, silence, and betrayal. His professors admired his work ethic and intellect, though many remarked on his guarded nature. He rarely participated in group projects or attended social events. He kept his world small and his focus sharp. But beneath the surface, the weight of what he had done never truly lifted. Testifying against his mother had been the right thing. It had been necessary. But it also left behind a silence more difficult to live with than any lie. He had lived through both, silence and truth, and discovered that neither offered peace, only different versions of loneliness. He thought often about his father, Greg. The man was now a collection of fragmented memories. A laugh heard through a door, a hand on a shoulder, the sound of him tapping his fingers against the steering wheel while driving. Caleb had spent so long trying to uncover what happened to him that the man himself had become a puzzle, a mystery defined more by absence than presence. Once the truth was known, Caleb began to mourn. Not just the murder, but the years lost, the answers never given, the bond severed by violence. Greg had been quiet, like Caleb, steady. He wasn't the kind of father who made grand gestures or loud declarations of love, but he had always been there. Until he wasn't. Caleb often replayed those final months before his disappearance, searching for clues he missed, moments that might have warned him. But he had been a child, and children don't expect their parents to be in danger from each other. Children believe in the safety of home even when it's built on lies. The most difficult questions, the ones he asked himself late at night, were the ones without answers. Had his mother ever loved his father? Had she ever loved him? Was he just a part of the image she curated so carefully for the world? Those thoughts haunted him more than the crime itself. The realization that the person who raised him, who held him when he cried, who made him dinner, who told him to believe in himself, was capable of such cruelty left a wound that healing could only partly reach. Occasionally, Caleb would receive letters, not from his mother, she had never tried to contact him again, but from journalists, documentary filmmakers, and true crime authors. They all wanted his perspective. Some offered money. Some claimed they wanted to honor his bravery. Caleb ignored them all. He didn't need his story to be dissected and broadcasted again. It had already been public once, and that had been more than enough. He also received messages from people he had never met. Victims of domestic abuse, others who had testified against family members, young adults who had grown up in households that looked perfect on the outside, but were filled with hidden pain. They thanked him. Some shared their own stories. Some asked for advice. Though he never replied, he read each one. It reminded him that the truth he had spoken had ripples, that his words had helped others find their own voice, their own courage. As the years went by, Caleb eventually found a rhythm to life. He graduated with honors, completed a master's program, and began working as a researcher in criminal behavioral studies. He focused particularly on cases involving family violence, hidden abuse, and manipulation. His work gained quiet recognition among professionals in the field. He wasn't famous, he didn't want to be, but his insights were respected. He lived simply in a small apartment with few personal items on display. No photographs, no trophies, no reminders of Cedar Hollow, or the house with the white picket fence. But on one shelf, tucked between psychology textbooks and case studies, sat a single item: the leather-bound journal he had once handed to the police. He had kept it, not out of nostalgia, but as a record, a reminder of where he came from and what he had survived. Meanwhile, Melissa Whitmore remained in prison. Her life became routine. Early mornings, structured meals, therapy sessions she rarely engaged in, and long, silent hours in the prison library. She never appealed her sentence, never gave interviews. Occasionally, rumors would surface about her writing a memoir, but nothing ever emerged. If she wrote anything, it was for herself. Some inmates viewed her with suspicion, others with pity. She kept to herself, never discussing her past, never mentioning her son. Whatever remorse she may have felt, she kept it hidden behind the same mask she had worn for years. Some said she had convinced herself she was innocent, that what she did was justified. Others believed she knew exactly what she had done and simply chose to live with it, stone-faced and silent. Back in Cedar Hollow, the town that once admired her tried to forget. The house was eventually torn down, the lot sold and rebuilt with a new modern home. The garden where Greg Whitmore had been buried was now someone else's backyard. Families continued to move in and out. Children played on the same sidewalks, and life resumed its ordinary rhythm. But there were still those who remembered. And when they did, they didn't speak of Melissa. They spoke of Caleb, the boy who had grown up in silence, and then found his voice. They remembered the courage it took to speak the truth, not to strangers, but in front of the one person who was supposed to love him unconditionally. They remembered the calm, unwavering way he sat in the courtroom and told the world what he had lived through. They remembered the price he paid for justice. Caleb had never asked to be a symbol. He had never wanted his story to be known, but in the end, that's what he became. A symbol of strength, of resilience, of what it means to choose truth over fear, even when it tears everything apart. And while the world may have forgotten the details of the case, some stories never truly fade. They remain etched into the people who lived them, quietly, permanently. Just like the memory of a boy who testified against his mother, not out of hate, but out of a love for the truth, and the father he never stopped missing.